it's very clear that the Liberals win this election. It'll be because of Trump and Canadians feeling emotional about Trump and concerned about Trump and seeing in Mark Carney someone who appeals to them as a sort of contrast to Trump or as someone who can handle Trump for whatever reason. And then the final thing that I would point out that I think is the biggest miss of all is the dismal performance of Jagmeet Singh and the NDP. They had a huge opportunity over the last couple of years to uh, be the party of the working class and to meld a kind of like socialist economic policy, left-wing economic, material economic policy for the working class with a more culturally moderate position that just wasn't obsessed with woke issues. There was a sense for many years from all parties that the solution to the housing crisis was to like have a new program and spend more money. But of course, the irony is like it's a supply side problem, and you're actually just stoking demand with most of your program. Not only are you not solving the problem, you're making it worse. You can't force creative people to create. You have to try to create the conditions for them to do it, or I think even a better way of putting it is remove the conditions that stop them from doing it. The fact that we are not exploiting those natural resources to compete on the world stage and drive growth and grow a bigger pie so that everyone's piece of it is bigger is just criminal.
Concepts with Shawn.
In this episode, we welcome back Ginny Roth. She's a partner at Crestview Strategies in Toronto. She's a sought-after writer, speaker, and political analyst. We start out the episode by asking 3 common questions or misconceptions that people have about the Conservative Party. Namely, are the Conservatives just a group of people who don't really care about people who have serious needs? Will Pierre Poilievre spend just as much as Mark Carney? Is the CBC a Canadian icon and as such a trusted and unbiased source of truth? Is Mark Carney nothing like Justin Trudeau, or are they the same guy? And then we get into a few more difficult questions. I ask Ginny, number 1, what missed opportunities there were during the elections, and I think you'll be interested in her answers. Is there any tread or traction on separatist fears with respect to Alberta and Quebec? What might be required to rebuild a Canada-USA working relationship? And can we ever have a strong relationship given our totally unbalanced starting positions? Furthermore, don't the Americans just look at Canadians as monarchists at best, or perhaps socialists in everyday behavior? And then finally, I ask her, if Mark Carney attempts to do a Justin Trudeau 2.0 policy platform, does Canada have the capacity, the resources, the human resources, the fiscal resources to implement such a program? I think you'll be very interested with what Ginny says. We had a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you dropping by, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Ginny, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Shawn.
Over the Easter weekend, a whole bunch of comments came up, and I just want to get your thoughts on a few of the comments. So the first one is this: the Conservative Party doesn't really care at all about people who really need care.
I think that is a fair takeaway for someone who has a busy life and who only checks in on politics periodically, which is a perfectly reasonable way to live your life. Um, and I think it probably stems from a dated view of the Conservative Party, and maybe one that isn't like totally well-rounded, let's say, but is still fair to hold if you only pay attention to politics every once in a while. And I think it probably comes from a period where conservatives globally had a lot of success, where a lot of their approach was to tackle an economy by restraining spending, cutting programs, bringing things in line after years and years of overspending and overly large government. If you look at Premier Mike Harris in Ontario, reforming welfare and getting more people off welfare, I can spend a lot of time explaining and justifying and giving the logic to those approaches. I think that in many cases they were the right thing to do. But there were people who probably suffered as a result. There were probably people who lost benefits, people who were poor, who felt poorer, or what have you. And there, I think the left in Canada has historically done a good job of, particularly the labor union movement, public sector labor union movement, of blaming conservatives for that and making conservatives wear that blame. They've been politically astute over the years in doing that. And so I think that's I wouldn't say common, but I think that is a view that some people have. People, particularly people of a certain age who remember that period, and maybe people who worked in public services in the public sector who had their job cut, or someone they knew had their job cut, or felt like their budgets were cut. I think that there were a lot of teachers, for instance, through those years of provincial tightening, who felt like they had their classroom budgets reduced and had to spend their own money on supplies or things like that. I would argue there were better outcomes that came from a lot of those changes, but it still has real world impacts on people. And so I think that's a reasonable view to hold. What I would probably say to someone like that over the dinner table, if they ask me, is if you look at the Conservative Party federally of today in the context of this election, and that's really not their approach. They're not taking an aggressive cuts approach. They're taking a pro growth approach, but that's mainly around reducing red tape and regulation. Shrinking the size of government, yes, but mainly in the areas where I think most people would agree the government has had excesses, like just too much government bureaucracy, not so much about programs. And I think that you see that reflected in a lot of the younger working class people who see the Conservative Party representing them and are telling pollsters they'll vote for them. But I think older people with maybe that same worldview might be a little bit slower to trust that the Conservative Party has their interests first.
Yeah, so you nailed it. Yeah, with public sector workers. So that's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah.
So the other comment that came up is, you know what? Pierre Poilievre is probably going to spend just as much as Mark Carney.
Yeah, that this question, the last question, showed the bind that the conservatives find themselves in. They get pressure from both sides, and to be fair, all parties do. Like they, this is the thing about Canada. It's a big country, lots of people, lots of complicated, different views, and you can wind up being squeezed on both sides. Where on the one hand, there'll be people who won't vote conservative because they think that they are just the same as the liberals, and there'll be others who think that they are going to slash and burn. They'll spend the same amount as the liberal. First of all, that there may be an assumption baked into that view that Mark Carney and that Mark Carney's version of the Liberal Party will spend less or be a more smaller government in its approach than the Trudeau Liberal Party, and that Carney therefore represents change. And I think that Carney tried to project that with his canceling of the carbon tax and the capital gains changes initially when he sort of first came out of the gate as Liberal leader and prime minister. But since then, it's become very clear to me, at least, that he really takes the same playbook and approach as Justin Trudeau did, a very big government approach, a very activist, high spending approach to government. He's making no bones about that. He's very worried about that in his election platform. And he has one view of the role of government. Poilievre's platform is out today. So for those who are listening, this is Tuesday, April 22nd, and the platform just came out a few hours ago. And it's in line with what I would have expected from Poilievre, which is it's not a slash and burn platform by any stretch, but there are spending reductions in key areas, and there is a sort of a reasonable path to balance over the next number of years. And so it represents a view of government where government shouldn't overtax in order to drive revenue and spend it. It's cutting taxes, which ultimately means less revenue for government and a smaller government, and it's kind of slowly pulling back a lot of the big spending initiatives that Trudeau built up all over the sort of long decade that he was prime minister. So I think there's two very different approaches, and I think it represents a real choice. Like I think that is Poilievre's strategic aim in this last week of the campaign is to really try to drive that choice of two different, very different visions.
Yeah, good answer. What I often try to struggle with is when someone asks me that question, and I say, in fairness, a lot of the budget that is in place are to meet promises or spending mandates that are fixed. You need police officers, you need
Hmm.
the border in provincially, you need a certain number of hospitals to stay open.
Right.
And so
That's
really
right.
the margin is small, but where you can really change things is on the way a government operates, how many outside consultants it hires, how many new
Hmm.
national surveys it does, and that sort of thing.
That's right.
Yeah. So the third one, and you have to promise not to smile when I say this, but this comes up often. The CBC is Canadian, and as such, it is a trusted and unbiased source of not just information, but of truth.
Yeah, I look, if I'm trying to steel man that a little bit or give it its proper due in terms of an argument, there would be people I think who would look to the BBC in the UK to PBS in the US and say there's like a rule for a public broadcaster that's not just like chasing page views or clicks and not appealing to the lowest common denominator. It just has some budget and some room to try to tell stories that appeal to a longer term view, to our history, to things that are like good for people that they may not realize are good for themselves from a consumer perspective. You could also argue that Canada is a really big country and there's parts of the country that just can't be covered economically. So if you just left it up to the market, there might be parts of the country that wouldn't get adequate coverage, and that local news does serve a kind of a good to that end. I also think there are Canadians of a certain age who remember a very different CBC and who have a lingering nostalgia for that. And there are some figures, I think of Adrian Arsenault for some, or as an example, but people who are beloved, who've been around the CBC for a long time, who still represent that era that they remember. And the quality of journalism, the neutrality, I think it's impossible for a newsroom to be truly neutral, but a kind of a gesturing at a institutional center, let's say, was I think a lot more robust 20, 30 years ago at the CBC. And there are a lot of people who remember that and who are fond of it. And when you combine all those arguments together, it feels why go after a national broadcaster? And I think Polyev has said that he would preserve Radio Canada, I think in part because Radio Canada still represents that in that perspective in Quebec. It really does reflect a common culture that they have. It has a really high viewership still and listenership, which the English language national CBC just does not. And defunding this, I also think it's important to point out, defunding the CBC doesn't necessarily mean that the CBC will go away. It could become a nonprofit and fundraise and just not rely on federal money to prop it up. It could try to be a for-profit organization, just like a lot of the startup media that's become quite successful in Canada. And that's endeavored to generate its own revenue sources. And so I'm for canceling the CBC, and I do think it's very biased. But I think that bias has emerged gradually. It's fairly recent. And I think there are arguments for a, let's say, nonprofit national broadcaster that does some things that might not be driven by a market instinct.
Yeah. I remember chatting with Rex Murphy on a plane ride, and I said, Rex, how the heck did you ever get onto CBC? He said, Shawn, I had so many people fall in love with me before they realized what I was like that they couldn't fire me.
Right. That's right. Rex Murphy, Don Cherry was on Hockey Night in Canada when CBC was
Yeah,
broadcasting it. There used to be a diversity of perspectives that you could find on the
sure.
CBC that would reflect the diversity of the town you live in, or, you know,
Sure.
or your family across Canada. And I just think that the gradual movement toward a really far left progressive worldview that's not diverse at all and very much to the exclusion of that diversity of views has been a real detriment and it's unfortunate.
Yeah. And then speaking of some of the older Canadian voters, I'm reading some of George Grant's work, and a lot of his
Hmm.
lectures were delivered on the CBC in the
Hmm.
1960s
Hmm.
and really in-depth stuff, talking about Augustine. And so if you have that vision of the CBC, I could see why people would say,
Hmm.
no, this is really good. But that doesn't exist anymore in
No,
my opinion. Yeah.
agreed.
So these are the fluff questions, and you're actually making them sound more legitimate than they are. So I
Well, I'm
appreciate that.
trying to give them their, I'm trying to give them the most credit possible of where they're coming from. So,
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. No, that's awesome. So the last one is this. Mark Carney is really nothing at all like Justin Trudeau. He's a completely different person.
look, there is a way in which Justin Trudeau always came off as a bit silly and immature. Like you think about the videos of him as a young person, like throwing himself down the staircase at a party because it was funny, wearing costumes, and there was always a bit of that like flair to him. He always seemed to have a bit of an immaturity. And I think his appeal in 2015, in part, that played into his appeal because he seemed to really connect with young people. He seemed like the beloved drama teacher, I think, for many young voters. And then I think people's opinion really curdled in recent years. And what was once an asset became a real fault of his, and that he just seemed frivolous and silly and not up to the serious task of the challenges of governing. And I can see how that, in contrast to that version of Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney seems more mature. He seems more experienced. Like he's had real jobs. He wasn't a drama teacher. He's a central banker in a couple countries. He's been worked in the private sector, etc. So yeah, that way I think they are fairly different. But from an ideological and worldview and policy priorities perspective, they're like shockingly similar. In fact, I think Carney is a lot like the early Trudeau days in terms of who he surrounded himself with. The key advisors are very similar. what they think the role of government is, the way in which they almost have a spiritual reverence for climate change policy to the detriment of almost everything else, and sort of basic economics, the way in which I think there's this like liberal guilt, I think, that informs both of them around doing penance for being sort of soft capitalists. They feel they have to pursue all these social justice causes and environmental causes, despite it undermining the very economic aims they claim to favor. And so I think all these things are very similar. And I worry that if Carney wins the election, there will be a lot of buyer's remorse because there will be a lot of people who think I'm getting a sort of centrist technocrat more akin to a Jean Chrétien or a Paul Martin liberal, and who will come to find that, in fact, it's not true at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Said, no, I think Mark Carney, at least from what I can see, appears to be much more experienced for sure. But not only that, I think probably a smarter guy overall. Smart people with bad ideas can actually get
Right.
a lot more bad things done
I think
than,
that's right. Good point. I hadn't thought of that.
yeah. So experience plus intelligence equals potentially really bad things.
Mm.
Anyways, okay. So now on to our more serious questions now. What do you think were some missed opportunities during the election cycle so far? We might see some big
Hmm.
things for the rest of the week, but up until now, and on both sides of the campaign.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I think that on the conservative side, there are a couple of areas that I maybe would have emphasized more. I think immigration is an area where public opinion is really skeptical of high immigration, and I don't want to undermine the campaign because Polyev has raised the Century Initiative, which is this quite radical aggressive pro-immigration plan that people around Mark Carney espouse and that he promoted to undermine his position on immigration. Paul has been very clear that he would reduce immigration and or keep it in line rather and set reasonable targets more akin to the Stephen Harper government. I think that's good policy. I just would have spent more time talking about it. Like I would have had more message days on immigration because it's an area where, if you look at the polling and the issue dynamics, it splits very well for the conservatives, or rather, it splits very well for people who are skeptical of high immigration. And the conservatives really tying themselves to that and forcing the liberals to defend immigration. I think that would have been a really useful wedge that they could have driven a little bit harder than they did. I also think that the Trump dynamics have created all kinds of strange decision making. There are a few huge podcasts out of the US, Joe Rogan's podcast, for instance, that reach many, many Canadian voters, many more than traditional broadcasters do. And I totally understand Poilievre's skepticism of engaging with the Canadian mainstream media, mainly because he doesn't get a fair shake with them. They're so biased, but also because their audiences are shrinking and they just don't have the impact that they used to. And I think maybe he would have been open to doing like a Joe Rogan or something similar had we not been in this intense Trump period. But I think he instead focused on Canadian podcasters to get his message out, which is fine and good. I'm glad he did that. There just isn't quite the same listenership. And had he been a bit more risk taking on that front, I wonder whether he would have been able to reach more Canadians. So I think those are a couple things that I would point to on the conservative side. On the liberal side, I think their platform is a big miss, and I was really surprised by it. They had a it's very clear that the liberals win this election, it'll be because of Trump and Canadians feeling emotional about Trump and concerned about Trump and seeing in Mark Carney someone who appeals to them as a sort of contrast to Trump or as someone who can handle Trump for whatever reason. I frankly find it hard to understand, but that seems to be where a lot of Canadians are, especially older Canadians. If I were him, I would have made the platform entirely about that. I don't think he had to take, it sounds like 80% of the platform was written for Trudeau. The campaign team had been working on it, and then the Liberal Party underwent this big change. I think he sat with it and he reviewed the platform that was developed, and then he decided to go with it. He brought forward this big platform with all these spending commitments and all these things that seemed like the kind of thing that Trudeau would want to do if he won another term. And I think that is a mistake because it's created a huge opening for Poilievre to drive a change message in the final week of the campaign. And I don't know where that's going to go or who's going to win. But if Polyev does win, I think it will be in part because Carney created that room for him. And then the final thing that I would point out that I think is the biggest miss of all is the dismal performance of Jagmeet Singh and the NDP. They had a huge opportunity over the last couple of years to be the party of the working class and to meld a kind of like socialist economic policy, left-wing economic, material economic policy for the working class with a more culturally moderate position that just wasn't obsessed with woke issues and that maybe was even open to being tough on crime or speaking to those working class people in a way that resonated with them, more like a Bernie Sanders than like a sort of champagne socialism you get from the NDP in Canada. And they just completely failed to take advantage of that opportunity. In fact, they've allowed the Liberals to completely consolidate the left in Canada, much to the NDP's detriment. And we may wind up with a situation where the NDP are at the same size as the Green Party, like just a total fringe party in basically a two-party system in Canada.
Yeah, those are great insights. Building off of the Singh comment, I couldn't help asking myself during not just his campaign, but over the last few years, I kept saying, why doesn't he speak like an old leftist, an old
Hmm.
Labor Party, union grassroots, we want to help the poor proletariat? And then I thought, because he doesn't get them at all. He doesn't understand
Hmm.
those aren't his
Yes,
people.
I think that's
And
right.
yeah,
I think that's
okay.
right. And the problem is it became self-fulfilling as the NDP became smaller. Rump of the party, like its activist members now are all of that champagne socialist, like more urban, woke, left-wing
Yep.
predisposition. And so it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And really, I think the thing that defines them most is wanting to stop conservatives, hating
Yeah.
conservatives, which explains a lot of Jagmeet Singh's behavior in the debate, where he was almost seemingly propping up Mark Carney. And yeah, I really think that is their raison d'etre is to try to stop conservatives.
Yeah. And then regarding Carney, I thought, oh, these guys are so brilliant. They've learned the Kamala Harris issue with Biden and don't run the incumbent. Let's get someone new. And I was
Hmm.
so surprised when they came out with the same policy ideas. I
Hmm.
just thought, okay, maybe they aren't as smart as I thought they were. But
Hmm.
yeah.
hmm I think that is similar to Jagmeet Singh, though. I think part of the explanation there that we forget, because we always want to assume politicians are like these strategic masterminds, and they
Mm-hmm.
may well be smart and may well be strategic, but they're also just human.
Mm.
And there's a reason that all of them are doing this, and it's because they have their own worldview that they think is a better approach or that informs a better set of public policies. And so I think part of the explanation with Carney is that he just believes that stuff. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Good comment. So the next question I wanted to ask you about is the separatist fear mongering. Is there any traction or tread depth on that story? And just before you answer, I pulled Rudyard Griffith's book off the shelf again. What's it called? Who Are We? Citizens
Something like that.
Manifesto.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my gosh, here's this guy. I totally forgot that it was in his book. He said nation versus notion. And he's really
Mm-hmm.
emphasizing, he was very passionate, at least in that
Mm-hmm.
book, about separatist narratives and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was trying to think, I wonder what Preston Manning would say, because I had him on here, and he's a Canadian expert on populism and worrying about separatist narratives gaining traction. So, what are your thoughts, Sarah? Is this something we should be more worried about, or is it maybe
Mm-hmm.
just a distraction?
I think it's maybe more useful for us to think about different levels of alienation and who might feel alienated or underrepresented in the next political moment. And I think the way that the polling is looking, there will be certainly be groups, and I think this becomes true in any two-party system. And it seems like we are we're moving into, or we're currently in a two-party system. We'll see if that remains. I don't think anyone knows whether that will remain the case and become the new norm or whether it's just for now. But in a two-party system, you wind up with a really split electorate and a lot of people feeling alienated if they don't feel represented in government. In Canada, I think that could be exacerbated after a decade and multiple mandates for the Liberals. If the Liberals win another mandate, that sort of puts off the ability of those alienated people to then feel represented again. And I'm not saying that's even a pejorative or necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just a fact. What's interesting about the current dynamic is yes, there's splits along regional lines. It's not going to be new if the Liberals win again that a lot of Western Canadians will feel alienated, and then some of them might even feel separatist. What I think is going to be new is that there's a lot of young people across the country, especially in Western Canada, who want a change, like a very different approach to governing in Canada. And a lot of that is driven by despair almost. I don't think it's unfair to say the word despair. Like, I think a lot of people are just, they feel broke, they feel down and negative about their prospects in their lives to like take major milestones like starting a family or owning a home. And then you have a lot of seniors who are feeling comfortable and fine. They may also have their own anxieties, but their anxieties have to do with Trump, with geopolitics, Canada on the world stage, et cetera. So, a different kind of anxiety. And if the latter group succeeds in getting to choose the prime minister and the former group doesn't, I think young people have a lot more energy around alienation that could be channeled into a kind of separatism than older people do. Older people are done fighting. And I worry a bit, especially in regions where alienation is pronounced, like in Alberta, and where regional leaders have tried their best to keep alienation under wraps and not allow it to spew out into separatism. Danielle Smith, to her credit, has done actually a pretty admirable job trying to keep alienated people in the tent and not letting them go off into the fringes. And I think that will become incredibly challenging if the Liberals win another term, because I think that group will grow bigger and it'll be even longer since they've been represented. And I think they'll be quite young and energized around wanting to express that feeling of alienation. And I'm not an expert like Preston Manning on these matters, so I won't speculate about where that could end up. But I think referenda, in whether it's in Quebec, Alberta, or both, and the policies that could be pursued on the road to that. So in Alberta, having their own pension plan, or their own police force, and there are other manifestations prior to that of reforming equalization, all kinds of things that provincial governments and regional governments might try to entertain in order to speak to those people if they continue to feel so alienated.
Yeah, good answer. So I was listening to an episode, I believe it's on Louise Perry's podcast from Britain, and she had an academic on, and they were talking about Civil War, so pretty niche stuff and
Mhm.
very nerdy. And this academic said there's a background risk of about 4% at any time for civil unrest.
Mhm.
And I thought 4%, oh my gosh, I thought this was like an unreality of 0%. This isn't something
Right.
we should ever think about. And yet, no, there are academics spending their lives studying
Sure.
this kind of thing. And so it's not something we should be consumed with, but it is a real concern. And
Yeah.
1995 referendum in Quebec, and
Hmm.
we've had many fairly serious separatist movements in Canada.
Yeah. And one thing I would say too is there's like certain factors. I don't know if this academic made this point, but I've seen this before from the research. In really bad inflation and like a cost of living environment that's really dire can ignite that small percentage of people or have that feeling spread a lot faster because people just feel more desperate. And so I would watch out for that if we end up in a situation where there's another liberal majority government where Mark Carney makes choice of putting Wilkinson back in cabinet, someone who's notoriously challenging for the natural resource sector. It sounds like a small thing, but that those series of events happen, and then quite a lot of spending leading to inflation. Those would all be factors that I would start to get a bit concerned about.
Yeah, yeah. So we're not just making this up. Like these are serious concerns. Anyways,
Hmm.
sorry for jumping around quite a bit, but we're
No.
still on the broader topic of politics and the election. But the next question I wanted to ask you about was with respect to rebuilding a working relationship with Canada
Mm.
and the USA. And are we ever going to be able to appear as even anything close to an equal partner, given the
Hmm.
inherent unbalance? And not only that, with respect to an imbalance in power, but the perception of Canada amongst Americans. I have a number of American relatives, but I've been talking with people who are working in the States on this podcast. And you go to conferences, and yeah, they assume at best we might be monarchists, but probably we're just old fashioned socialists. And so, how can a socialist or the perception of a socialist country create and sustain a working relationship? And then on top of that, you have the power imbalance and the size difference. Have you turned your mind to
Hmm.
those issues?
Yeah, I think I have views on this that are a little bit boring and non-alarmist and not at all in line with where a lot of Canadians are feeling. I think Donald Trump, as a figure and person and personality, brings out a lot of reactions in people, and I get that he's like very erratic and he's willing to say things that other people aren't willing to say. But there's some like basic facts that I think people are forgetting. First of all, we never had an equal relationship because we've always been a tenth the size, and so that's just by its nature that relationship can never be equal. It can, though, be mutually beneficial. It can be like symbiotic, even if it's a little bit unbalanced. And and not only can it be, I think it is very likely to be. And the reason it's very likely to be is because of the market opportunity for both countries. There's no exporter of goods in the US who sells into Canada who wouldn't want access to our market and wouldn't want as low barrier possible access. And vice versa, and even more, there are no Canadian producers who don't want to be able to sell into the US market in as low a barrier and environment as possible. And so, not to sound like a brutal capitalist about it, but I think there's like market realities about the benefits of free trade between two countries with a massive land border who speak the same language, who are used to dealing with each other, for whom border crossing is relatively easy, and when you reduce those trade barriers, the flow of goods is really quite simple and makes a lot of sense. But those facts just all remain true. And actually, there are a lot of people who will say all of Trump's experiments with tariffs and other trade barriers is actually recreating the very strong argument in favor of free trade because it's showing everyone what you lose when you don't have freer trade. And I think at the end of the day, Donald Trump is a deal maker, and he's not going to want to be in a political environment, whether it's around the midterms or really any time, where he starts to become unpopular because the stock market's crashing, the cost of goods are going up for people in a way they didn't expect, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think all those forces mean he will make a deal. People are talking about Kuzma, our more most recent deal, as if it was this incredible, seamless deal. No, there were protections on both sides, whether it's supply management or whatever else. There always are, and there will be again. But I think we'll just come back to um, a decent, moderate deal with the US, and relations will be renormalized, and we'll look back on this period where we happen to have a federal election at the height of the emotion around this Trump period. And it will seem in retrospect like such a distorting, weird moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the way you frame that. I think you've said that the facts of the matter have more salience than the reality of the imbalance. If we focus on the imbalance, really the only endpoint to that focus or that line of thinking is some sort of aggression or heated conflict. Imbalance
Hmm.
is only an issue if one person has an ability to use their excess power to
Hmm.
force their way. But that's a really dire, I mean,
Hmm.
it's on people's mind, but I don't think it's a reality. It's not as salient a reality as the facts that you've shared. That's where our minds should be focused. So, yeah, that's a better way to reframe it for sure. My last question is this, and then we'll ask you what you think we should be asking as opposed to just answering what I want to ask. But my last question is this. Even if Mark Carney attempts to implement a Justin Trudeau 2.0 liberal vision, do we have the capacity, so the institutional capacity, the human resource capacity, the fiscal capacity to implement such a vision?
Mm. Yeah, you started to run into this, like even in the early Trudeau days, where there was this like strong sense of a mandate for federal government programs as the solution to problems. And let's just allocate a bunch of spending in the form of a program or a grant or what have you, negotiate the details, and that will fix the problem. And there was this weird thing where it was like hard to report in the media and hard to explain, but it was like the Liberals couldn't even spend their own money. Like they could commit the money, but in the budget, but then they couldn't spend it. So they would have these unspent envelopes around infrastructure. Like they had these huge infrastructure funds, and they just couldn't get it at the door. They like couldn't match the projects. They couldn't, and that inability, like that lack of state capacity, or that inability to just solve the problem with a program, is, I think, an under discussed phenomenon. But I think people feel it intuitively. And so, like the housing, I think, policy area is the biggest area where this is true. There was a sense for many years from all parties that the solution to the housing crisis was to like have a new program and spend more money. But of course, the irony is like it's a supply side problem, and you're actually just stoking demand with most of your program. Not only are you not solving the problem, you're making it worse. The fact that conversation has opened up on housing and that we're finally able to like confront that reality, I would like to see that happen on childcare. I would like to see it happen on energy. And certainly this is something that probably even the conservatives believe, like the whole premise of the remove the gatekeepers approach is to say we need to deregulate. And let the private sector play a role here. Um, I know, Shawn, you care about seeing this in healthcare. I think that's happening in some provinces a bit more covertly, like whether it's Nova Scotia or others who are trying to push it against the boundaries of this. It would almost be interesting in a way, like if I was like a sick person who just wanted to have an experiment, to have another Carney government and just give them a majority and give them free reign to be like, okay, great, go for it, see what you can do.
Yeah.
Like the sky's the limit. There's no fiscal anchor. See what you, because I think it would hopefully prove to Canadians that even if you don't run out of people's money, and even if you don't cause inflation, which are two really big ifs and two huge problems, you actually still can't, as a government, make houses, create childcare spaces, train people, like all these things that the economy needs to do through like dynamic, entrepreneurial, self-motivated actions. Government playing a role in that tends to stifle it, not encourage it. And because you get to it, I'm now making almost a philosophical point, which I think all have like an intuition for, but sometimes need to learn by seeing, because it's tempting to believe that government can fix things. It feels faster and better. And so now I'm going to be getting a bit away from your question, but I think that my answer to your question is I agree that what you were getting at, which is that I think a Carney government attempting to do this would confront the same challenges as that the Trudeau government has, and maybe even worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. Don't ever apologize for getting away from my question. That's the whole point. I just put a shiny object and hopefully it sparks some thoughts. So I was chatting with Danielle Dufour, who's president of MEI right now, and we were
Hmm.
talking about this whole housing promises we're hearing from both parties. And even Pierre Poilievre's approach, and I think he's bang on in what he's saying, removing regulations,
Hmm.
opening things up, incentivizing municipalities to promote building. But that's only one side of the equation. You still have the whole
Hmm.
building industry that needs to actually become efficient. And Daniel was saying
Hmm.
that many of the approaches that are still in place were designed for the post-war era when there was a
Hmm.
surplus in labor and not enough jobs to go around. So we would
Hmm.
have three people hang a door and paint it instead of one
Right.
person. And so there's a fundamental reorganize or a new mindset that needs to
Hmm.
take place. And there, I don't know that government they can set the stage and say, hey, we'd really like you to think differently.
Hmm.
Maybe it'll happen organically, right? If you're a
Yeah.
Hayekian, a spontaneous organization will flourish. But I worry about that side of it too. I still think Poilievre's got the right idea, but for us as voters to think that government can solve this is
No.
no.
No. And I think it's dangerous when people start to think that, oh, there's this thing that has to happen in the private sector where, like, basically it's the classic innovation thing. People always use the word innovate. Like, and it's true, the private sector, the only way you get productivity is with some kind of innovation. Someone innovates a new, faster, better way of doing things. I always get nervous when governments imply that they can be the ones to force that to happen. You can maybe incentivize or even better remove disincentives. Like I think that's the best thing you can do as a government is remove disincentives to innovation. No one looks at major productivity jumps and boosts in innovation and thinks like it was a huge government program and government forcing someone to do that made that happen.
Yeah.
Um, at most, you could argue that historically there have been moments where the Department of Defense in the US has created like an environment where people have been able to be innovative that's been funded. And I suppose that's true. Like I think there are ways you can do that, but not by forcing them.
No.
You can't force creative people to create. You have to try to create the conditions for them to do it, or I think even a better way of putting it is remove the conditions that stop them from doing it.
Yeah.
And so often the conditions that stop innovation are otherwise well-intentioned government initiatives that get in the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. So for knowledge workers, they aren't motivated by carrots and sticks, which you'd think, why don't you write more books because I'll give you money for it? No, they actually don't. They're motivated by curiosity and the sense of autonomy and ability to shape their environment and to
Hmm.
accept contracts or not. And so
Yeah.
all of these,
Or the very dirty concept these days, and I'm the one that's critical of hard-edged capitalism, but the profit motive, like the thing that drives businesses and entrepreneurs to innovate and drive product and increase productivity is a profit motive that you then want in an ideal economy. You then want those entrepreneurs to attract investment, to reinvest their profit in more productivity and grow in that way. You want it to be a healthy capitalist competitive economy, all of that. But there is still is this like profit margin, the power of the profit motive rather, at the core of all this that is going to be far and away the best driver to have people innovate, to increase productivity that government just cannot be a substitute for.
Yeah. And just before we leave the whole policy stuff, because I get all excited when we talk about it, and
Hmm.
there's a great big thick book. I think it's about 700 pages by Carolyn Toohey, where she looks at the scale, scope, and pace of change in healthcare policy in
Hmm.
Canada, US, Britain, and the Netherlands. And in her final analysis of, I believe, almost a 30-year period, and she's quoting a lot of other researchers in the area too, the biggest changes often come as byproducts of our initial policy intention. It's almost
Mm,
as though an accident of history had to happen. You needed the
right,
right players, the right capacity, the desire.
right,
And not to say that governments aren't involved in shaping that accident of
sure.
history, but for us to think that any government is going to be able to come up with a policy to allow for some of the exciting innovation that we're hoping will happen is really short sighted.
Yeah. And I think we
Yeah.
forget that often.
Yeah. It's humbling too to say, oh, we're putting our money on an accident of history. That doesn't sound very serious of us. But, anyways, we're getting down to the end. What should we be thinking about over the last few days of the election period? Or what should we be thinking about in general? What keeps you awake at night?
It's a different version of what we were just talking about, I think, not so much on the innovation side, but just on the even more basic than that, the idea of growth. I didn't grow up in Alberta. I don't specialize in the natural resources sector per se, but Canada is in such an unfortunate economic situation when it comes to the fundamentals like our GDP per capita, which I think is the best measure of just what how it is to be a Canadian in our living in our economy. Let's put it that way. When you look at those measures, you really, I think, it makes me think about what are our fundamentals as a country? What are the things that we can take advantage of? And it just seems so obvious to me that we have all of these great mineral deposits. We have all this oil and gas. We have an abundance of natural resources. And the fact that we are not exploiting those natural resources to compete on the world stage and drive growth and grow a bigger pie so that everyone's piece of it is bigger is just criminal. Like it just so defies logic. And it sounds so obvious. Like through my whole lifetime in politics, that's been a fixation in an area of interest and something that almost makes people's eyes glaze over at a certain point because it seems so obvious. And yet here we are. We've not been able to do that. And I have been frustrated to see that Mark Carney and the Liberals have, it's almost like at the beginning of the campaign, they paid lip service to that. In the same way that they, canceling, so-called canceling the consumer side of the carbon tax and the commitment on capital gains, it was like Mark Carney said he decided he had to pay lip service trying to move major projects forward in order to level himself out with Polyev and look like he was different from Trudeau. And since then, he's really moved off of it. First, it was dumbing down how he was talking about major projects. Then it became clear that he wasn't going to make some of the changes required, like removing Bill C-69, which is a really anti pipeline bill, deregulating in the most basic sense. And then he was almost overtly saying, probably not pipelines. When I say major projects, I'm not sure pipelines. And then he started to really clarify that what he meant is like maybe some electricity projects here and there. It was just in 30 days, he's gone from very ambitious, ostensibly ambitious pro major projects approach that sort of implied or even stated that it would be about exploiting our natural resources really to something that is much more akin to the status quo. And I think that is just such a missed opportunity. And I think it's also an area where if he wins, there may be a lot of buyer's remorse because I think there'll be a lot of voters, especially like male baby boomers who we know tend to have this common sense view of what we should do as a country. And I worry that he will have gotten away with a bit of a sleight of hand on that file. And putting the politics of that aside, as frustrating as the politics of it are, just the reality, like this sort of tragic reality of we could go another decade without taking advantage of that opportunity and what that really means for just regular people, which is they get a smaller piece of the pie, which means their wages don't keep up with costs. They put off buying a home, starting a family, thriving, to me, that is tragic. And so that's just something I've been thinking about. And as conservatives, I think it's incumbent, if that does happen, if the Liberals form government, it's incumbent on us to find just better ways of explaining to people what that difference is and what that missed opportunity looks like.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, just listening to you, it almost sounded we're spending all of our time and energy and debating and discussion and research on how to spend the paycheck that we've already earned.
That's right.
And whereas
Right.
you're saying we have to actually earn something before we can debate redistribution and whether or not that's a good investment or not. You have to actually
Yeah.
have something to invest.
Yes. And we have all this material under our feet
Yeah.
that we're just not taking advantage of.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Ginny. I really appreciate the time and effort you've put into all of this and sharing some of that with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Shawn. I love these conversations.